What's up, guys? The video we're about to dive into today should shake you to your core because I'm freaking terrified of it. The thought of it even happening, is just mind-boggling. What would happen if WW3 ever did erupt? Now, hope to God this never does happen because it is a tragedy. All war is tragedy. It should never be fought. Get some peace through other terms. It should not have to turn to violence. This video is going to dive into what would actually happen in the world, the global climate, what would be going on if this were to erupt. So why don't we just dive into this and see what, I don't know, see what they got to say.
And military forces clash on land, in the air, and on the sea, and underneath it, in the most violent war to date. But what would actually happen after World War III? The probability of a third world war is negligible but not impossible. All three of these big military powers who have the capability to launch a global war all have too much to lose by doing so. But history is full of examples of small conflicts spiraling completely out of control and beyond the plans of those who initiated them. To find out what the world would look like after World War III, we have to examine
Before we even dive into the video, I don't want to say this is going to happen because the odds are it probably won't. But just for the microscopic chance that it does happen, I would want to be somewhat prepared, you know what I'm saying? So I'm not saying it's going to happen. I hope it doesn't happen. And they say World War III, I don't know what it's going to be fought with, but World War IV, that's going to be fought with sticks and stones. I don't care what you say. I think that was Albert Einstein who said that.
Different global wars, a conventional war, and a nuclear war. One thing is for sure, the economic damage alone would reshape the face of the Earth. Such a war would inevitably begin by a confrontation between U.S. and Chinese forces in the South or East China Sea. A Sino-U.S. war isn't likely to go global and would require multiple escalatory steps to get there. First, China would have to directly threaten or attack Japanese forces, something that is predisposed to do already because of the presence of multiple U.S. air bases in Japan. If China wanted to keep Japan out of the conflict, it would have to avoid striking these bases, which would have seriously detrimental effects on its ability to fight against the US. Next, a third party would have to be willing to exploit the situation to its own advantage. The most likely culprits here are India, Iran, and Russia. India would be tempted to act to push Chinese ground forces out of the contested northern border regions and perhaps even maneuver itself to throw China out of Tibet, thus threatening Chinese freshwater supplies and granting it massive leverage over its rival. That's unlikely but not impossible, as a Sino-American war would largely be fought at the sea and in the air, leaving the People's Liberation Army free to fight against Indian incursion. Iran, however, is likely to exploit the diversion of U.S. forces from the region for its own gain. A war between the U.S. and China would inevitably cause a drawdown of U.S. peacekeeping forces in other regions of the world. Currently, 60% of U.S. firepower is in the Pacific, but as losses rapidly mount, the U.S. will need to pull reinforcements from its multiple other global commands. With American forces no longer acting as police against bad actors, Iran could use the opportunity to attack Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states with its superior military. This would hugely disrupt global oil trade and have devastating financial repercussions across the world. Russia might seek to exploit U.S. preoccupation with China for its own gain in Europe, while Russia has no ambition to rule.
In times of unrest, that's when you're going to have a ton of changing going on. Like, put it this way, when the teacher is busy with one student, what's going on in the classroom? There's a lot of, stuff going on. So, you gotta, in times of unrest, that's when a lot of change happens.
Of Europe, it could see a drawdown of U.S. forces in Europe as the opportunity to take by force breakaway Soviet republics and even some of its NATO neighbors such as Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. In a worst-case scenario, all three flashpoints are ignited due to American preoccupation with China, leaving the world dramatically different after the war. Such a war is almost certain to end with a U.S. victory over China, although an extremely costly and poorly defined victory. Immediately at war's end, the United States military would be severely depleted, going from the world's most powerful fighting force to a significantly weakened force that still has global reach but will take a decade or more to restore itself to its former glory. American naval and air losses would be staggering, as with much of half of its air and naval fleets destroyed. Half of the U.S. aircraft carrier fleet would be sunk in a conflict with China, a loss of over $50 billion in ship costs alone, over 500 aircraft and over 12,000 seamen and aviators. The loss of all important American carriers alone would see the United States lose its ability to rapidly respond to global conflicts.
That's
this loss in capability.
Nobody freaking wins from war, and sometimes somebody might not even try and win. They might just try and hurt you so much that you can't do other things. You can't possibly oversee certain nations if you are that weakened. So the winning might not even be the goal in some countries. I'm not saying in this scenario, but sometimes you just want to weaken a force so much that it can't oversee other nations.
only be compounded by significant losses in the U.S. Air Force. Without the ability to rapidly and overwhelmingly respond to global crises, the immediate post-war years would see an ignition of regional wars across Africa and the Middle East. Critics of U.S. military presence around the world would rapidly see the cost of losing that peacekeeping force as simmering tensions suddenly explode in the absence of a threat of U.S. involvement. In the Middle East, Iran would seize the opportunity to attack its longtime rival Saudi Arabia. Despite being an oil-rich and wealthy nation, Saudi Arabia is handily outclassed militarily by Iran, as it has relied on the United States to keep Iran in check for decades. No other power is likely to prevent Iranian aggression in the Middle East, nor do they have the capability to do so. All European powers, save for France, simply no longer have the expeditionary capabilities to respond to military conflicts around the world without U.S. support, and France lacks the assets needed to significantly counter Iranian aggression so far from its own shores. An oil-rich Iran would become a regional superpower, shaping the Middle Eastern policy to its own liking. This would inevitably lead to an explosion of extremism, with waves of attacks against Europe and African nations, launching both continents into a dark age of terrorism. Enriched by Saudi Arabian wealth and oil fields, Iran could continue a campaign of conquest unchecked across the Middle East, forcing other neighboring nations into its fold and simply invading those that resisted. With its finger firmly on the oil tap to Europe, Iran would have great influence over European powers, likely leading to a necessary buildup of military forces in Europe and an inevitable invasion of the Middle East years later. A European-Middle East war would be a world war in its own right, with staggering casualties on all sides and economically ruinous for both regions. Middle East turmoil would only make the lives of those in China worse. In the aftermath of a war against the U.S., the Chinese Navy and Air Force would be obliterated, with only those forces left in reserve in western China against India or Russian incursions left intact. Chinese infrastructure, at least along its eastern Pacific border, would also suffer moderate damage due to American long-range air attacks, while China can do little to militarily threaten the U.S. homeland. Large-scale damage to Chinese port facilities would only exuberate the damage caused by years of American naval blockade. China relies on the Pacific for the majority of its trade, and most importantly for the import of energy resources. Despite heavy losses, the U.S. Navy could still undertake an effective blockade of Chinese trade, crippling the nation and resulting in a GDP loss of as much as 35%. China, in return, could threaten U.S. trade in the Pacific as well, but would be unable to directly threaten either the American West or East Coast, resulting in only an expected GDP loss of 10% for the U.S. But the disruption of trade in what's the world's most important trade superhighway would only result in the weakening of the East Asian economies and, to a smaller extent, the entire world. East Asian nations would be the hardest hit due to their dependence on Chinese goods. This will have a knock-on effect on European nations who import cheap goods manufactured in East Asia. The ensuing worldwide economic recession will lead to flare-ups in social unrest and widespread unemployment. This, combined with a worst-case scenario of Iranian aggression in the Middle East, could set the stage for revolutionary movements in some countries and the flare-up of partisan tension spilling over into outright violence. Perhaps no nation would be as rocked, though, as China, who, despite inflicting incredible losses on the U.S. military, would still be facing a humiliating defeat, with a near-total loss of its Navy and Air Force. American cyber warfare operations would work to steadily degrade the Chinese government's ability to censor information electronically.
Yeah, China is very intelligent. They don't want to just jump into a world war right now, but they have said that they want to conquer the world by 2049. That's in their plans, but they're not ready to do it yet. They're preparing right now. So you have to be very vigilant and conscious of what's going on. But the problem with China is that they have so many people. I think there's billions upon billions. It's probably the most populous country, if I'm not mistaken. It might be India. It's one of those two. It's incredibly populated. So they have to have enough resources to sustain the people, or else the people are going to revolt. Why are we taking this? But then again, it's also hard to revolt in a social credit system, and everyone's monitored so intensely. So
throughout the nation, and increasing unrest and war weariness would embolden pro-democracy and separatist factions in China. While it's likely that the Chinese government would remain intact, this would represent a significant threat to the Chinese Communist Party, directly leading to even more violent crackdowns on an increasingly rebellious population. We've already seen this scenario in miniature thanks to the Hong Kong riots, and while China showed restraint in Hong Kong because of international pressure, it's unlikely to show restraint when faced with similar uprisings within the mainland when the survival of the CCP is threatened. The further disruption of the Chinese economy would have a domino effect on the rest of the world, especially those nations that rely on China for critical technology and imports. Global GDP would shrink significantly, leading to unemployment and unrest across the world. While the rest of the world is suffering, though, one nation might come out of a third world war smelling like roses. Russia has long suffered under a weakening economy, made worse by European sanctions due to its aggression in Crimea. However, the loss of Chinese trade routes throughout the war and a need by China to replace its destroyed military equipment would be a massive financial boon to the state. European powers might be even willing to lift sanctions against Russia and provide economic concessions or even political ones, such as allowing Russia to reabsorb former Soviet republics in exchange for the aid of the Russian military in fighting against Iranian aggression in the Middle East. A new global order after World War III would see Russia rising to a position of prominence it hasn't held since the days of the Soviet Union. But now let's look at a worst-case scenario: complete and total nuclear warfare that spans the face of the Earth. While a conventional World War III would still see the United States suffer the least militarily or economic harm, a nuclear war would almost completely level the playing field between China and the US, leaving both nations a ruined, smoking wreck. The US still holds the advantage in number and sophistication of nuclear weapons, thus China would inevitably suffer far greater damage than the US. However, nearly every major US city would suffer at least one nuclear strike, with most coming under fire from multiple warheads. Should Russia join the fray, it would inevitably pull in nuclear NATO members such as France and Great Britain, and spread thermonuclear warfare across 4 of the world's 7 continents. Previous fears of nuclear winter have since been proven to be overblown, but a global cooling effect will still take place, dropping global temperatures by a few degrees. A drop of just 1 degree centigrade in global temperatures would make Canadian wheat growing impossible, showing us just how vulnerable the global food supply really is. What farmland isn't rendered fallow by a drop in global temperatures would likely be unusable due to nuclear impacts. Both the US and Russia target each other's vast swaths of farmland as nuclear targets, with the express intent of starving each other into submission in case of nuclear war. With the US alone exporting much of the world's grain, it wouldn't just be the Americans that starve, but much of the world
The scary thing about this is that it literally only takes one thing. One thing. You do one thing because you don't want to push a country against a wall. A country that is against a wall fighting with their backs, they have nothing to lose. They're like, all right, yeah, why not? Let's just do this. What else do we have to lose? We're about to lose anyway. So it's a very, very tricky situation we're under right now. You want to win the war, but you want to avoid the war at all costs. But if you're in a war, you want to win. But at what costs?
Well, compound that with strikes against Russia and Chinese food-producing regions, plus contamination from other nuclear strikes, and hundreds of millions would begin to starve within weeks. The initial casualties would also be in the hundreds of millions, with hundreds of millions more falling prey to injuries and radiation sickness within days to weeks. Then, secondary effects of global nuclear war would lead to even more deaths, as trade routes are disrupted, infrastructure is rendered inoperable, and diseases caused by high concentration of airborne debris strike down people by the millions. Many nations around the world would rely on imports to feed their populations, and the loss of global trade alone would doom tens of millions to immediate starvation. As massive plumes of choking dust and debris spread across countrysides in Australia, North America, Europe, and Asia, respiratory disease would claim millions more. Global firestorms would decimate wildlands, as fires ignited by burning cities spread for hundreds of miles around, causing fires so fast that they'd be visible from space, if not for all the debris in the atmosphere. If one could peer through that thick haze of gray that would remain aloft for days or even weeks, they would see a planet in flames, with fires raging for weeks or even months and killing millions more. The world population would likely fall to below 1 billion within 5 years of global thermonuclear war. Within a decade of starvation, disease, and conflict for dwindling resources, humanity would be lucky to number in the 500 millions. However, there is good reason to think that humanity would not go extinct after all, and could even bounce back in time. Most nuclear strikes are designed to maximize destruction. A ground burst of nuclear weapon severity limits its destructive range, as most of the
10 years,
If you're
500 million?
older, then this trading strategy can
We got like
potentially help
8
you
billion
pocket
now.
an extra.
That's like
An
1 in
explosion is
16
sent down
people
into the
survive.
ground or absorbed
That's freaking terrifying. We have
by ground features such as
Terrifying.
buildings,
1 in
hills, etc.
16?
Therefore, nuclear weapons are designed to explode over their target, greatly enhancing their lethality and avoiding ground clutter altogether. While this makes nuclear weapons more lethal, it has the positive side effect of sending more of the resulting radiation upwards and into space. Fears of a global irradiated wasteland might be overblown. And while it's certain that radioactive debris would be in harmful levels just about anywhere on Earth, humanity and the livestock and food crops it depends on could still survive in sufficient numbers to eventually bounce back. That's because the fissile material in a bomb is destroyed in milliseconds, causing an intense burst of radioactivity that quickly falls off as atoms decay in a chain reaction. In several years, most radioactive fallout would turn into more stable elements, such as strontium-90, with its half-life of 29 years, strontium-90 and similar materials are still harmful, but not nearly as radioactive as materials with a half-life of hours, minutes, or even seconds. As Nagasaki and Hiroshima have proven, it doesn't take long for humanity to reclaim the ruins of cities struck by nuclear weapons. The real danger is in the sheer number of weapons employed in a global nuclear war, and thus the higher concentration of less dangerous but still harmful, longer-lived radioactive isotopes in the water and soil. Human lifespans will be shortened dramatically, and many species will go extinct due to climate change, natural ecosystems will collapse, and a staggering amount of pollution will be created by the incineration of hundreds of major cities. Even after all of that, within centuries, humanity should be well on the rebound. What shape the world would take, however, is completely unknown, though it's likely that none of the current major powers would continue to exist as cohesive states. In all likelihood, it would be Africa which would become the lotus of economic and military power, as it's least likely to be directly affected by nuclear war, and unlike the rest of the world, they'd still be able to feed most of their population, as many African states have agrarian-based economies. One thing is certain, the nations that launched World War III would not be much more than dust, and utterly inconsequential in the new era of human history to come. World War III has broken out. The most powerful countries on the planet are launching missiles at one another and sending invasion forces across the globe. It's only a matter of time until you get caught up in the whole thing. All you want at this point is a safe place to...
Isn't that so wild to think about? The countries that are like mocked nowadays, like, oh, they're so behind on the times, Africa. If this were to happen, we would be going to them saying, please, please, give us some
lie low
resources.
and wait for the whole thing to blow over.
Oh my
Should you go to an
gosh,
island
it's
nation
a
in the
terrifying
tropics
thought.
or a country at the bottom of the world? Maybe there's an even safer place that you didn't even know existed. Let's find out which safe haven is right for you. It's impossible to tell who exactly will instigate World War III, but we have some pretty good ideas. The most likely scenario would start with one country invading another. This would cause the allies of the country being invaded to come to their aid. Slowly, more and more nations would get pulled into the conflict. At some point, this confrontation would reach critical mass, and an all-out world war would commence. The sides are pretty easy to predict for World War III, as they probably would follow the current geopolitical climate. One side would consist of the United States, the European Union, and the rest of NATO, while the other side would be made up of Russia, China, North Korea, and their allies. There would probably be some wild cards that we can't predict, but one thing is for sure, World War III would be a true world war. What we mean by this is that very few people would be able to escape the carnage. Unlike the previous world wars, humans now have the ability to fight one another over long distances using aircraft, long-range missiles, and space warfare. Very few regions of the planet would be untouched by the events of World War III. However, this does not mean there aren't any safe places to run to. In fact, a few countries would provide safety and peace of mind as the world falls apart around you. If you're looking for a safe country to escape to during World War III, some of your best options are tropical islands. This may sound too good to be true, but hear us out. The good thing about islands in the Pacific Ocean is that they are really far away from each other, and the main...
See, that's the thing. During World War II, planes were around, but they were nowhere near what they are today. Today, I could be in China in like less than a day. That is freaking wild. So the fact that warfare has changed so much in the last like 80 or so years, it just creates a mystery that no one genuinely knows what would happen if this erupted. But we don't want to know. Where would be a safe place to hide? I'd go to Ireland, because who's got a problem with Ireland? I don't know. I think they just fly under the radar, so that'd be my spot.
The Pacific Ocean is a vast place, and if you don't mind warm climates, catching your own fish dinners, and white sand beaches, Fiji would not be a bad place to wait out World War III. This island nation sits in the southwestern part of the Pacific Ocean. The closest continent is Australia, which is still over 1,700 miles away, and the great thing about this is that during World War III, Australia probably won't be hotly contested over, which just adds to the allure of escaping to Fiji. Even if the fighting eventually reached the Australian continent, you would be so far away that you probably wouldn't even notice. Fiji itself doesn't have much to offer in terms of wartime strategy or resources. It has a very small military of around 6,000 individuals, so it would not be seen as a threat by either side. But perhaps one of the best things Fiji has going for it in terms of remaining safe during World War III is that it doesn't have many natural resources within its borders. Beautiful beaches and an abundance of seafood tend not to be what the world's superpowers are after while at war. This means Fiji would likely not be a target, making it one of the safest countries you can move to if World War III ever broke out. While the world descended into chaos, you could be sipping pina coladas on a white sand beach with a fishing pole in the water. Or better yet, You could be drinking the national beverage of Fiji called kava, which is made of the crushed root of the yangona, which has been shown to have medicinal properties. This is another thing that would make Fiji such a good...
They say that, but now everyone has seen this, and everyone knows Fiji's the place to go, so everyone's gonna be flooding towards Fiji, and the population is gonna freaking quadruple. So maybe I
nation
don't
to hide
know.
away in if World War III happened. Although it doesn't have strategic significance, it does have an endless supply of food, fertile lands to grow crops, and plenty of ways to keep yourself busy. In fact, there are around 300 islands that make up the country of Fiji. So if you didn't get along with your neighbors, you could just load up your boat and cruise to a different island. The only problem is that you'd be so far removed from the fighting that you might not know who was winning or even when the war came to an end until long after it was all over. During a world war, global communication would probably go down as satellites are targeted by each side to disrupt enemy transmissions. This would mean the only way to receive news would be by word of mouth. Like in the olden days before the internet or telephones, you'd have to wait until someone physically came to the
That would be
island and
scary.
informed you about what was going on across the ocean. Then again, if you're trying to escape World War III, you probably don't mind not being up to date on wartime news, so this wouldn't be a deal breaker. If Fiji isn't isolated enough for you, there is another island nation in the Pacific that could be even more appealing to hide on during World War III. Tuvalu is a 10-square-mile island chain just over 1,000 miles north of Fiji, making it
You curious to see how I got paid $2,317.16 this month without lifting a finger? I literally did.
even further from mainland. There are only around 11,000 people on the islands of Tuvalu, and its remote location and lack of natural resources make it an undesirable target for either side during World War III. If you did seek refuge in Tuvalu, it's likely you wouldn't see anyone new for the duration of your time in the island nation. Tuvalu is hard to get to in the best of times, so the two airlines that fly to the country probably won't be doing so at all with a world war going on. This means that the only other
You see, what a scary thought that we're all talking about this like it's a real possibility. This is talking about the end of the world, pretty much, and we're just saying like, oh yeah, if it happens, just like pop over there, go there. I'm like, wait a second. You want me to abandon everything in my life, everything in your life? Could you imagine just dropping like at the drop of a hat and everything's over, starting fresh? That's a freaking scary thought. And also, don't you think those island residents would kind of be like, okay, get the heck out of here. We don't want anyone new. I don't know.
to access the countries by boat. It's unlikely that one of the sides in World War III would divert resources to Tuvalu, as it serves no strategic significance, but like Fiji, there is plenty of food and resources that can be gathered from the ocean to help sustain you throughout the war. There's another island country that is much larger than Fiji and Tuvalu, and although it's a little closer to the mainland, it would still provide safety during World War III. New Zealand is a beautiful nation that seems to have plenty of every type of environment crammed into a...
It's not like we're getting a warning, like, okay, WW3 will be happening this day at the afternoon, so get ready. No, it could just happen, boom, right now. Don't even know. Like, that's the scary thing. No one knows. It could just start like that. So you won't have any warning.
Single island.
So you have to
If you're
be
looking for a
prepared.
safe place to hide from the carnage of World War III and still want seasons and ecological diversity, New Zealand is the country for you. The country itself is a little over 1,000 miles from Australia, but it sits further south than both Fiji and Tuvalu, meaning that New Zealand could potentially be further away from the main front of World War III, which we would expect to happen in Europe, Asia, and in the North American continent. However, there are many more natural resources in New Zealand than in most other island nations. This would be beneficial if you sought refuge there during World War III, but it could also make the nation a target for invasion. However, due to where it's located, this seems highly unlikely. There also isn't really much strategic significance to invading the country. The nation itself has fertile lands, abundant marine resources, and various landscapes that would provide protection even if the war did reach the island. Around 30% of New Zealand is protected land, which means there are plenty of areas where resources can be gathered, and where you could hide away if needed. It may sound crazy, but there is another abundant resource on the island that would help you ride out World War III. For every person in New Zealand, there are 10 sheep. This means you have plenty of wool to make clothes, and a source of protein if times get hard. The sheep also help fertilize the land and can provide milk as well, meaning that these useful creatures will be your best friends as you safely wait for the war to come to an end. There are many benefits to living in New Zealand even when the world is not at war, but perhaps what would make this nation the ideal location to move to is that its infrastructure is highly developed and the country has been working on becoming self-sufficient for decades. It's because of the steps that the government has taken in recent years to ensure the country remains a safe, comfortable place to live that New Zealand consistently is rated one of the top 10 happiest countries in the world. So if you're looking for a country that is isolated, Safe and provides an abundance of resources as well as beautiful land to live on during World War III, New Zealand has got you covered. New Zealand does its best to maintain a peaceful country, which means it'll likely stay out of World War III altogether. In fact, New Zealand is only second to Iceland on the Global Peace Index, which brings us to our next safe country if a world war breaks out. Iceland is over 1,000 miles from the United Kingdom and the rest of Europe. This means it's unlikely the country will be in any direct danger during World War III. Like many other island nations thus far, Iceland has tons of marine resources that would allow it to remain self-sufficient if World War III ever broke out. What makes Iceland a great place to be during a global war is that the country gets 100% of its energy from renewable sources, all of which are within its borders. Iceland harnesses a massive amount of geothermal energy and converts it into electricity and heat. While war rages across the planet, Iceland would not have to worry about procuring oil, coal, or any other forms of energy from different parts of the world. Being totally self-sufficient means Iceland could stay out of the conflict and focus on keeping the people inside its borders safe. Some parts of Iceland can be pretty arid and harsh, but there is abundant fresh water and seafood. If you made your way into the mountains of Iceland, you would be isolated and protected from the rest of the world. There are fewer resources in this region, but it's incredibly doubtful you would ever encounter a military force while living there. However, the best place to be in Iceland during World War III would be along the coast, so you could take advantage of the plentiful fisheries and aquatic resources. As long as you don't mind eating seafood every day, you would have a full belly for the duration of the war. There is plenty of land to settle down on in Iceland if you need to find a place to wait out the war. In fact, the current population puts an average of 8 people per square mile in the country. This means there is plenty of space for refugees of World War III if they decide to relocate to Iceland. If you plan ahead, you could even find a nice piece of land in a small Icelandic fishing village that's self-sufficient and safe to live in until the war is over. You might even decide to stay after it's safe to return home. There is one downside to Iceland, however. The fact that it sits between Europe and North America might cause it to be a staging area to launch invasions across the Atlantic. This scenario is not very likely, as both sides would probably blow each other up with nukes before they would send an invasion force across the Atlantic Ocean.
I was literally about to say that you don't want to be in the middle of all that war going on. You don't want to be that one country in the way. No, you want to be tucked away like Fiji, like you said before. And also, I'm starting to realize that during this, you can't be a picky eater, because I'm a very picky eater. I don't really eat much. I eat the same foods over and over again. I feel like that I would be screwed over in this. I feel like you would need to just be able to eat whatever. You have to just be able to survive, and I guess that's what, I don't know, you just gotta be able to eat anything, drink whatever, and just
even though there is a chance
best.
that a fleet might sail by Iceland or even make a stop on their way while crossing the ocean, living in northern Iceland will all but guarantee your safety during World War III. There are other island nations that would actually be closer to the action but could still offer some safety during World War III. One such country actually started out as a military fortress during the Crusades. Malta sits just off the coast of Sicily in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. In World War III, this might be
That was part one. If you guys want a part two to this, just let me know in the comments. I'll watch the rest of the video. It's been about like 20-something minutes. I thought this was going to be a 20-minute video when I hopped on it. But yeah, it's kind of a scary thought. World War III. And the fact that they're talking about it in such a chill manner, I'm just like, oh my gosh, it's freaking terrifying. And they haven't really talked much about what would happen during the war. Like, who would win? What are the odds? It's been mainly, how the heck do you hide? There's billions of people on the planet. And I'm sure if it were to ever start, or like the outbreak were to happen, this video would get like 1 billion views. And everyone's going to be freaking flooding Fiji's gates. So I don't know how successful they would be. We're just going to take advantage of the opportunity. But I guess it's good to be prepared, informed. If you guys want a part two, let me know in the comments. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did, make sure to smash that like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what else to react to next, and take it easy, everybody. Until next time.